Alrighty, I think I'll start with some small words. I'd like to first introduce myself. I'm Merve Gvandran. I'm PFC's Communications and Mobilization Coordinator, and welcome to today's webinar session. Today we'll be discussing Dr. Adam Saifer's preliminary findings on his ongoing research on the experiences of equity-focused grantees within the philanthropic sector. This webinar will also focus on the barriers and the challenges faced by grantees working with philanthropic funders and how these are influenced by racial, gender, and class inequalities. We will then turn the floor over to Richenda, Grazette, and Katie Hutchinson, both from equity-focused grantee organizations, to discuss the preliminary research findings and how these findings map onto their own experiences within the sector to ameliorate grantee-funder relationships. We would like to remind our participants that there is a simultaneous French interpretation available by clicking on the language settings below your screens. And please use the Q&A function also at the bottom of your screens to ask questions, and as our panelists will take the last 15 minutes to answer them. To begin, we would like to recognize the many territories of Turtle Island on which we work and reside. These territories are home to many Indigenous peoples who have lived here for tens of thousands of years and continue to live here. PFC itself on Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is located on the unceded land of Kanien'kehá:ka Nation and has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. As settlers, immigrants, and their descendants, and as visitors, we honor and respect to many Indigenous peoples of this land and hope for a more just future together. Moderating our panel today is Inès Chaâlala, PFC's Director of Learning and Partnerships. Inès has worked with PFC for the past 3 years, and she has been developing the implementation of PFC's learning programs, as well as its strategic partnerships. In 2018, she helped launch the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program. And right now, she leads the work on this collaboration with PhiLab on DEI from the ground up and the grantee perception of DEI within the philanthropic sector since March 2020. This project aims to examine how DEI policies and initiatives instituted at the foundation level are experienced at the grassroots level by equity-focused grantees. Before working with PFC, Inès has held several positions at the United Nations and in non-governmental organizations, in particular on governmental, environmental governance, sustainable development, gender, and innovative finance. Thanks for being here, and I'll pass it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Merve, for the introduction and for setting the stage for our conversation today. Let me start by introducing our panelists. We do have a great lineup today for you. Dr. Adam Saifer is a postdoctoral fellow with PhiLab at l'Université du Québec à Montréal, as well as the director of PhiLab's Quebec Hub. His research draws on theories of capitalism, nation, and race to critically examine the possibilities, limits, and tensions of philanthropy's role in fighting for social and economic justice. As Merve mentioned, Adam is leading the research in a project with PhiLab, La Fondation Chagnon, and PFC on diversity, equity, and inclusion from the ground up, exploring the experiences of equity-focused grantees within the Canadian philanthropic sector, and has had the opportunity to meet with and interview leaders from 30 equity-focused grantee organizations. So today he will share with us the preliminary findings of this research project, and we welcome Adam with us. Our second panelist, oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Did you want to say something? Go ahead.
I did not, I just jumped the gun a bit.
So our second panelist is Katie Hutchinson. She is the executive director at Vibe Arts. Her career has centered around charity and nonprofit work that provides young people with support and opportunities to thrive. Vibe Arts' two-tiered approach to arts education provides equity-seeking artists with opportunities to become creative leaders in their communities while providing marginalized children and youth with meaningful experiences to spark their creative potential. And last but not least, Richenda Grazette is a community organizer and nonprofit administrator whose work centers the voices and realities of queer, BIPOC, and marginalized youth. Through her role as interim executive director at Head and Hands, where she worked in fundraising for 6 years, she explores transformative approaches to governance, organizational development, and fundraising that align internal processes with organizational values. She also sits on the board of directors for the Coalition of Community Coalitions, COCO. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here. So let's get started. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Adam, who will be making a 15 to 20 minute presentation on the key preliminary findings from this research. We're really curious and happy to have you share this with us today. Adam.
Thank you. And thanks to the panelists and for everyone who is tuning into this. So as Inès mentioned, my name is Adam Saifer. I am a postdoctoral researcher with PhiLab at UQAM. And I'm going to be talking today about a project that I launched alongside PhiLab, PFC, and the Chaâlala Foundation at the beginning of March, which, as you can probably imagine, was an interesting time to start in-depth conversations with equity-focused organizations. But nevertheless, this project, broadly speaking, seeks to examine DEI philanthropy, but from the perspectives of grantees. You can go next slide. Oh, one more, sorry. Yeah, perfect. And so just a bit of background before starting. So over the past decade, DEI talk has become increasingly prominent throughout the philanthropic sector. So we're seeing with different foundations, it's being included in their mandate. We're seeing foundations generating reports on DEI policies and practices, releasing statements and blog pieces. Then if you look at practitioner publications like the Stanford Social Innovation Review or Alliance Magazine, these sorts of venues are publishing articles on the subject as well. There's also a number of research initiatives. As Inès mentioned, PFC has been supporting some research around DEI philanthropy in Canada. And there was a major project called the D5 Coalition in the US that finished a few years ago that really explored diversity, equity, inclusion in philanthropy really in depth. And all this talk around DEI philanthropy has become even more prevalent during COVID, as you can probably imagine, because as has become clear, COVID really revealed and exacerbated the racial, economic, gender inequalities that shape and that characterize Canadian society. You can go to next slide. So when I originally started immersing myself in this world of DEI philanthropy, I noticed a few problems that existed or that characterize the existing research. The first is that a lot of the information and data that we have around DEI philanthropy follows a top-down approach. And by that I mean that it really focuses on policies, programs, and practices of foundations, generally as articulated by staff and directors. Related to that, a lot of this data is shaped by unequal power relations. So you have data that's being collected by foundations, for instance, about their grantees, but all that information is really shaped by unequal power relations because grantees exist within this competitive sector, and grants are hard to come by. And so that that sort of information, that sort of data is always going to be shaped by those power relations. And the third concerns methods. So a lot of this data was gathered or has been gathered through survey methods. And while surveys are super helpful for gathering a little bit of data from a lot of organizations, it sort of lacks the capacity to really examine these issues in depth. So as a result, despite all this talk around DEI philanthropy, we actually know quite little about how grantees who actually do equity-based work or social justice work on the ground navigate the Canadian philanthropic sector. And when I say navigate, I'm talking about things like the process of securing funding or maintaining funding, or working together with funders, or demonstrating impact to funders. You can go next slide. And so the research project that started in March was really based around 3 questions here. The first is, what barriers and challenges do equity-focused grantees face working with philanthropic funders? The second is more of an analytical question. So how are these barriers and challenges shaped by race, gender, and class? And finally, trying to understand how equity-focused grantees respond to and navigate these barriers and challenges. You can go next slide. I'm not going to get too far into the methods, but I think what's important is to state, well, first, that this preliminary data is based on in-depth, semi-structured interviews with leaders from 30 equity-focused organizations in Toronto and Montreal to begin. And also that when I use the term equity-focused grantee, this isn't sort of like a formal category. It's a term that I've sort of created for the purposes of this project. And what I'm using this term to do is to name charities and nonprofits that focus on systems and structures of oppression and power, rather than, or in addition to traditional charitable service work. So some of the organizations I've spoken to, for example, might address the structural barriers faced by non-binary youth, or the context within which immigrant and racialized artists work, or Indigenous peoples and the criminal justice system, that sort of thing. You can go next slide. And so today, I'm going to introduce 4 of the overarching themes that have emerged from these interviews so far. These themes are likely familiar to you. They exist throughout the philanthropic sector. But what has become clear through these interviews is how these issues and themes uniquely impact equity-focused grantees. And the goal with this research is to be able to take this, this knowledge, these perspectives from grantees, and use it to inform how we understand both the possibilities, but also the limits and the tensions of DEI philanthropy as a strategy to fight for social justice. So the first theme I'm going to be talking about is the tension between core and project funding. Yeah, this tension between short-term project-based grants and more general core or capacity funding is commonplace throughout the sector. But what has become clear through my interviews is that this takes on a uniquely racialized and gender dynamics for equity-focused grantees. Specifically, many participants describe this tension between investing in, I think what one participant called the cool DEI project versus investing in general organizational costs. So one participant, for instance, said to me, a lot of funders want to say, we're funding this amazing project, which is really good and cool for the funders to talk about that. But in order to do that, we also need to pay salaries. A second participant suggested that there might be a bit of a white savior fantasy playing out in this desire to fund DEI projects over operational costs, over labor, and over supporting existing successful programs. Another participant pointed out to me that they felt there was an inherent devaluing of the labor done within equity-focused organizations by funders. And they thought, they mentioned that, you know, they asked, why would funders rather spend money on supplies over people? And they also pointed out, which is an important point, that much of this labor done within these organizations is done by women and people of color. And here is a quote referring to that specifically. They said, really, you'd rather pay for a bunch of supplies that aren't going to get used as opposed to a well-paid human to go and deliver these programs? And nobody would ever ask if they were if they were opening a new startup business. Well, how much are you spending on people? I'd rather spend it on computers. So that's one major theme as it relates to core versus project funding. Another major tension is understanding that long-term flexible grants are particularly vital for equity-focused grantees because they allow them to build trust and relationships with social movements, with communities, with activists who are doing that social and economic justice work on the ground. And as I'll discuss later, participants say that equity-based or movement-based work is messy, it's long-term, it's difficult to quantify. And as a result, project-based funding, or what some call projectization, is a serious issue for grantees that are trying to do equity-based work. I can go to next slide. The second major theme concerns the language around diversity and inclusion. So while in theory, diversity and inclusion as relates to staffing, as relates to ideas and grant making, is certainly an important aspect of making philanthropy more accountable to the communities it serves, participants highlighted issues with how these terms are deployed. Specifically, participants expressed suspicion regarding diversity and inclusion as a funding category. The first quote you see here, I look at surface diversity as something that's just diversity for paper. You have your tokens of each and you can check off the boxes. This participant expressed a view that was common throughout the interviews, which is that diversity and inclusion mean nothing by themselves without genuine equity and justice principles. Another participant told me that it's not just about the what and the how of DEI funding, but also about the why. So who is the language of diversity serving? They wondered whether funders are looking to reflect on their role in perpetuating inequality, or are they looking for a win-win scenario that both improves their reputation and their brand and makes them feel personally or as an organization as if they are tolerant and oftentimes good Canadians. In other words, it's the why of diversity and inclusion funding that determines whether the grantee feels supported or not. A second different but major theme that came up was the emphasis on cultural diversity or symbolic diversity over racial inequality or gender inequality. So a focus on the symbolic aspects of diversity rather than the material or the political inequalities that shape our society. And the one person I was speaking to worked specifically in the arts, and they said to me, I have filmmakers that are racially diverse and not culturally diverse, who are making movies and the story has nothing to do with culture. And it's hard to get funding if you're not talking about the culture that funders think you should be talking about. And so what this participant was highlighting is how an emphasis on these symbolic differences can actually redirect attention away from gendered and racialized economic inequities that funders and wealthy donors might be implicated in through the ways that they make money, through the policies that support their philanthropic giving. And again, shifting this towards a focus on cultural diversity, which in theory allows everybody to win. Next slide. Participants also emphasize that establishing and building relationships with funders is all about who you know. So in other words, you can only receive funds from foundations or corporations if you have somebody on the inside. And sort of a representative quote from this about this is, it's really all about who you know. It's continuously all about who you know. And while this obviously creates problems for grantees throughout the philanthropic sector, it creates a unique tension for equity-focused grantees. So on the one hand, grantees believe that their boards should reflect the communities they serve. So for example, if the grantee organization works with racialized newcomers to Canada, they feel that their board should be composed of folks with that lived experience. So why is that? Well, because in theory, these key decision makers will have knowledge about the issues or the best interests of the community at heart, or establish trust networks with the community. But on the other hand, philanthropy and fundraising is all about who you know. So this creates challenges for those organizations in terms of connecting with majority white wealthy funders in two ways. So getting in the door, which I mentioned before. Again, funding relationships are often about who you know, about social networks, that sort of thing, but also in terms of actually building relationships. In fact, some participants actually describe the ways that they've had to police their behaviors in particular ways in order to gain the trust of funders. And one participant who has worked in fundraising said to me, when you're a person of color or a queer person or a trans person in fundraising, funders look at you and they're like, let me help you, or they look at you and they dismiss you completely. So that's one major theme around this. Another one, which I'm not going to go into too much detail, but is around the issue of non-qualified donees and DEI. So the regulations that govern who foundations can legally fund. And there was the sentiment or the belief that this inability to easily direct philanthropic funds to community organizations and social movements doing frontline work for social justice is a major issue for DEI philanthropy. So it's a major limit to what DEI philanthropy can do and what DEI philanthropy can be. Next slide. And the final theme I'm going to talk about is around metrics and accountability. In my interviews, participants highlighted the challenges with quantifying impact as an equity-focused organization, and then the details of this change based on what the focus of the organization is. Nevertheless, there was this shared sentiment sort of across the interviews, this sort of this difficulty sort of measure in terms of understanding how to measure or quantify equity and inclusion in the long run. It's just this belief that equity-based work is messy and it's difficult to measure. As one person who worked for an educational organization told me, you cannot get at the crux of the issue if you're not willing to enter this very, very, very messy conversation about what's going on inside the system. Another participant gave me this example. They said that funders' metrics often focus on the intervention, and the example that he gave was to help an individual get a job. But then they said, but the metrics don't care about what happens if and when that job is lost. And then he adds to that equity-focused work focuses on the second part. It's about creating a society that is equitable and supportive when that job disappears. And this is really difficult to track. This is really difficult to measure. And in terms of on a purely practical level, many equity-focused grantee organizations lack the resources to track and measure this impact, particularly if it occurs long after the program intervention is formally finished. And so a key tension that arises around metrics and accountability is simply, who are these organizations accountable to? Every single leader of equity-focused grantee organization that I spoke with believe that grantees shouldn't have to be accountable to their funders in the same way that they have to be accountable to the communities that they serve. So the question then becomes, what does this accountability to the communities that you serve, what does that mean for metrics? If the goal is to be accountable to communities, many grantees I spoke to explained that uniform approaches, uniform metrics simply don't work. The ways that we measure and account for our work, or the ways that they measure and account for their work, need to be tailored to the particular context. As one interviewee told me, they can't just use uniform approaches because some places are number-based, and that's fine. And some places are narrative-based, and some places have a mixed model, the way they see their work. And then again, on a more sort of practical level, one grantee told me that the actual practices of collecting data can really disrupt the rapport building that occurs between the grantee practitioner and the program participant. So that's just one example, for instance, about in terms of how these metrics and approaches need to be tailor-made to the specific situation that we're talking about. You can go to the next slide. Great. So there's a few key takeaways from these four themes. The first I would say is that projectization, or the focus on project-based grants, hurts or uniquely hurts equity-focused grantees in both the short term and the long term. And I would say to funders that are interested in supporting equity-focused grantees that it's time to invest in core long-term funding. They really need to focus on long-term funding and flexibility. And this is both in terms of supporting capacity, but also in terms of supporting the ability of grantees to build relationships with the community actors that they're working with on equity and social justice issues. The second key takeaway concerns the language of diversity and inclusion. And it's this acknowledgement basically across my interviews and seemingly across the sector, that DEI can so easily become a box to be checked or an empty symbolic gesture. And so the recommendation that I would have would be to consult with your grantees about what language best encapsulates the work that they do. Let your grantees and the movements they work with construct the framework that represents how they approach their work. A third key takeaway would be that when equity-focused grantee boards reflect the communities they serve, the grantee is placed at an immediate disadvantage when it comes to establishing relationships with and working with the philanthropic sector. So it's really key that funders understand these limitations and that they be actually proactive in terms of creating these new relationships with grantees. Additionally, it's also really important that as foundations, engage in this ongoing DEI work, they really need to apply this sort of reflecting around DEI to their interactions that they have with grantee fundraisers. And the fourth takeaway would be that universal metrics and measurements are not really useful for equity-focused work. It's time to really get creative. And it's also, again, time to listen to grantees and the communities they work with and be very proactive on this front in terms of really trying to understand how grantees how they sort of frame the work that they're doing and what a successful intervention or a successful program looks like. Remember, it's the grantees and the communities they work with. They understand the problems and the issues that are manifesting in their community, and they understand the ways that it should be addressed. And so, and the tools that they need to address it. So again, it's important to be very proactive on that front and to listen. Go next slide. So yeah, those are sort of the four key or preliminary themes that have emerged from these interviews. And I'm very happy that for everyone who's joined to learn about this research. And I'm very excited to hear the response of the other panelists and to see what questions you have about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. So before embarking with in a conversation with Richenda and Katie and hearing their perspectives, maybe I'll have a question for you. And if we can go back, Murphy, can you go back to the key takeaways slide? Or yeah. So when we look at this, we do realize that this could be generalized to all grantees and not only equity-focused grantees. So what is your take on, what is the major difference between grantees in general and equity-focused grantees in terms of their perception with regards to their philanthropic funders or partners? Is there something that really sets them aside?
I think we really have to look at each individual theme. So for instance, if we're talking about short-term versus long-term grants, yes, that is something that is common throughout the sector, but the need to sort of build long-term relationships with social movement organizers is something that is, I believe, unique to equity-focused work rather than more traditional service work. If you're looking at organizations or grantees with the sort of goal of like long-term structural change, or looking at these larger sort of systems of power, you need to sort of build those alliances. And that's extremely difficult to do if you're told that you need to have a short-term project that you deliver on in a very short amount of time, and you don't know if you're going to get the next grant, for instance. And then again, I think that if we go to, if we go to the first slide around that, for instance, I don't know if we can go there or not, but this emphasis on the cool DEI project is definitely something that is unique to sort of funding work that is doing organizing around social and economic or racial or gender justice. And so I just think it's really, really important to understand how those dynamics play out in the equity-focused grantee context in a way that they might not play out in a more traditional grantee organization. And I think that applies to sort of each of the key takeaways. Obviously, the language around DEI is unique to equity-focused grantees. I think that the metrics and measurements are unique to sort of this long-term equity-based organizing. And I think that tension around board makeup is a real tension for equity-focused groups. Do you in your heart that your board should reflect the communities that you're working with, but they often will not have the social networks that are necessary to be able to secure funding. And then once you enter that situation where the fundraiser is working with the funder, those dynamics are difficult as well.
And how do you think COVID-19 and the pandemic, and we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that this research project started in March, but it was designed and thought about before the pandemic started. So how do you think this the pandemic has impacted the relationship with equity-focused grantees?
I think we're still seeing how that plays out. I think that funders have been certainly a lot more flexible and have sort of provided, or in a lot of situations have provided a model for a better model for how to support equity-focused grantees, whether that's through opening up grants, opening up restrictions on grants, or being proactive, or that sort of thing. On the other hand, you see a lot of equity-focused grantees having to sort of put their more advocacy, social justice work on hold in order to focus explicitly on service work, because our social safety net has gigantic holes in it, and COVID-19 has only sort of exacerbated and revealed that. So they've become the sort of like frontline defense, and it's this weird sort of cyclical thing where it's like doing social justice and advocacy work is what would prevent these holes in the social safety net, but in this particular moment they need to turn away from that in order to work with communities that they serve.
Thank you, Adam. So let's start hearing and listening proactively to the perspectives of Richenda and Katie on this. So we've heard about the key takeaways from Adam's research, especially on the point of project-based funding versus core longer-term funding. And can you speak to the ways in which this model helps or hinders your organization and the equity-focused work that you do? And what do you think would be a better model? If you have some insights, suggestions to share with us today. I'll start with Richenda.
Thanks. So thank you for having me. I want to start out by saying that I understand the desire for project-based funding in philanthropy. It enables funders to spread out more of their funding and try to reach more people. But there are challenges. The advantage in our organization is really that project-based funding helps us pilot things that are new, that we want to see if we have the capacity for it, if it works for our clients and that kind of thing. However, we've found that what happens is when the project funding runs out, if the project went well, either there's more labor on us to try to secure longer-term funding or a second round of project funding from somewhere else, or the project closes, which is really destabilizing for our clientele. I suppose maybe I should talk a little bit about Head in Hands. So we're a nonprofit in Montreal and NDG, and we work with youth 12 to 25 through 9 different programs and services, and it's all direct frontline work, including medical, social, and legal support. So this is the perspective we're coming from, is direct frontline work with kind of the base needs of our client base. for organizations like us and other orgs I've worked with, our entire work is essentially DEI. We work to prioritize youth experiencing marginalization. And so what happens is when project funding is one of the few remaining options in the philanthropic sector, our core work, like running a medical clinic or counseling, just aren't able to get the funding they need because it's difficult to innovate something that is at its base transformative by simply existing. So our medical clinic, for example, is one of the only clinics, or maybe the only clinic that's not tied to the CIUS system in Quebec. So we're a fully independent medical clinic. And with that, we are able to see youth with no insurance. We are able to do different kinds of care work. We come from a queer and trans-focused approach in a lot of our work as well. So what we do already is different than the medical system. And if we're asked to innovate on top of that, there's very little we can do to innovate it. Even innovating our work takes away from what we do if we try to innovate, because at its core, it's healthcare. There aren't that many more approaches that you can come up with than giving any youth access to a medical clinic with care that prioritizes their needs. And our work is quality over quantity. So sometimes we have clinics where we see 2 people and they each get an hour of our time. So in that way, project-based funding is challenging for us for our programs where there isn't much room. The second piece that I always think about when it comes to project funding is in grassroots organizations like ours, we seek to have a staff composition as well as a board composition that reflects our clientele. And that means that our staff are at a higher risk of burnout and or compassion fatigue because they see themselves in their clients. So we are working with people whose lives are like ours, which means that we are experiencing the violence of oppression and marginalization in our personal lives, and then also taking on the violence experienced by our clientele. And without core funding, it's harder for us to do the work we need to take care of our staff in order to provide better services. So better access to mental health support, higher pay, those kinds of things. And with project-based funding, we could increase some salaries, but we have a flat salary structure. So we have to increase everyone at once, which means we have to get core funding to do that. And we cannot increase all of the salaries through project-based funding, unless theoretically the project with salary increases, but I've never heard of a foundation that does that, but that would be wonderful if somebody did that. So yeah, I think speaking on the model that we would like to see, I think more for core funding is great, but I understand there's limitations to how long you can continue offering core funding for. We do have some funders who've been with us for many years who do core funding, but I think exploring with your grantees ways that they can build more core into project funding is another way to do that work, for example.
Thank you, Richenda. Before I go to Katie, maybe Richenda, have you had any experience in what I would call, I'm just sort of coming up with the name right now, but hybrid funding, meaning that within some sort of project-based funding, you have a component that kind of includes like capacity building of the organization and something a bit more long-term that does not, is not aligned with the project funding, but is part of it. Does that exist? Have you experienced that?
We've experienced that. I'm trying to think. I can think of a couple of places where we were able to build in some sort of capacity work, like access to external evaluators, although that has mixed results, and softwares, training for staff, that kind of thing. It is rare though, but we have accessed it. What we do largely is in our project-based funding, part of what we do is repackage some of our existing programming into project funding language. And in that way, it compensates and adds to our core. So we'll also build in sustainability costs, which are fundraising costs, because our fundraisers are paid from core. So it's a bit more of a workaround, but we do have some funding that does explicitly have a mixed model for sure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Richenda. Katie, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I think Richenda was getting at something there too that I wanted to point out was sort of the creative grant making, where you do, end up pushing a little bit of one program into a project to ensure it's sustainable. And, it becomes a bit of a puzzle that then internally you need to manage both reporting on that, but then continuing to do this core program. And if the focus, I always like to find, ask funders to fund the charity as opposed to fund the project. As a charity, we will deliver projects, and they're based on our community demands, they're based on our artists' needs and lived experiences. So to trust in the organization is really important. The second piece, and I think Richenda was sort of touching on this as well, is the HR component. So anyone who's run any sort of business knows that when you have a good team, that is something that is invaluable. The problem with project grants is that sometimes it causes you to have short-term contracts. And I see this a lot, especially in the arts sector, projects that are short and you hire this amazing person for 7 months and then it's over and they're on to the next best thing. And that's really hard from an onboarding perspective. If you've ever onboarded someone before, it's a long process. You don't build that same passion. When I took over as executive director 3.5 years ago, that was one of my main mandates, was that I was going to get a team that reflected the community we were serving and that they were all going to be full-time staff with benefits and maintain that. And it's really, really hard to find that money. So again, with the creative grant making, it's like, okay, I'm gonna put 4 hours of this person's time and 8 hours of this person's time, but then we have 10 grants that are making up hopefully those 40 hours. I spoke to a donor recently and I let her know that we offered a benefits package. It's a small benefits package, but we offer a benefits package, which is almost unheard of in the small charity sector. So, and she said explicitly to me, I'm not interested in funding that. But to Richenda's point, my team is also made up of equity-seeking folks who have gone through their own adversity to get to where they are now, and they're building their careers, and creating decent work in-house needs to be the first priority. So then we're able to deliver meaningful work outside of this space. So the project grants sometimes create a barrier for that, because as soon as it's over, it's like, what happens now? So I'm looking right now at funding our 2021 year, and it's not looking great because project grants have gone down because of COVID. And so I'm trying to backfill with finding some, new funders, individual donors, people who can really understand our mission, because the demand for our services have just gone up. So I think that answers the question.
Thank you, Katie. Adam talked about during his presentation about the language around diversity, equity, inclusion, what it means for funders, what is the mainstream definition within the philanthropic sector. But really, we want to hear, what do you think diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to your organization? And what are your thoughts on DEI as a framework for social justice? And I'll start with Richenda this time.
Last time I thought I was going second.
Oh yeah, it's true.
I'll let Katie go first. We'll keep the
okay. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Katie.
Yeah. So the DEI sort of framework is not, we don't use that language within our organization. We talk a lot about anti-racism and anti-oppression. We have mandatory training from board, volunteers, staff, and any subcontractors and artists that all need to take part in our organization-wide anti-oppression training. So it's baked into what we do. We want to make sure we have consistent language across the board. But to Adam's point in his slide is that equity is the outcome. So we hope that through delivering this training and holding people accountable to delivering our services in that way, that the outcome will be equity. We know there's work to do and it's never perfect. And I'm not claiming that our organization gets it right every time, but every time we don't, we take we call them our courageous conversations, which we have once a week, where we sort of pick out something that's kind of hard to talk about, and whether it has to do with our organization or within current events. And we talk about how you know, we can overcome this and be better in what we're doing for our clients and stakeholders. So instead of it being a project that's focused on DEI, I think if the organization has it baked into what they do, it will naturally serve an equitable outcome in the end.
Thank you. Katie, Richenda.
Yeah, it's very similar work at Head and Hands to what Katie mentioned. We also don't use DEI. Well, maybe we use equity, but we don't use diversity and inclusion when we talk about our approach. And we also don't get it right every time because that's impossible. I think that what it means to our organization is much more about experiencing or allowing yourself to experience discomfort when you make mistakes and working towards improving yourselves. And we do that a lot. I like the idea of regular conversations, although we don't have those that way. I think that what we bump up against with respect to fundraising and our grantors is that our existences in marginalized bodies are inherently political, and we generally see diversity as a sort of activism that's free from the politics of existence, which for us is incongruous. So when we're asked by funders about the diversity of our organization, either our client base or our staff, it doesn't mean anything really to us because they're not engaging with what that means on a bit of a deeper level and not seeing how they are engaged in that work either. And part of it is philanthropic sector being not particularly diverse, but also about what those folks who do represent diversity mean and kind of how we can engage with organizations' work that serves marginalized folks in a way that acknowledges the violence that they experience. So I'm trying to think of an example from our work where we have, let's say, our counselor working with a client and our funder asks us like, oh, how many Black clients do you see? And we'll say, well, we see 25% Black clients, for example, in our counseling sessions. But what we actually don't talk about with our funders is the myriad ways in which like each individual person of color's experience affects our work and how that particular client is so much more than their number, but also part of a network. And we try to see the whole there. And I think maybe Adam mentioned that as well in his presentation about what happens when the job is lost. And it's the similar attitude where, you know, if you're doing an intervention with one individual, what about the network of people they encounter? How are they impacted by that work? And I think diversity and inclusion are so simplistic ways of approaching something that is really political and really intense for staff and clients. Another thing this makes me think about is when organizations take political stances and how that could affect their funding, always being a concern for fundraisers. So my organization, for example, supports defund initiatives in Montreal. And part of what we talk about is what is that going to mean for some of our funders? Will we lose any funding or lose any support if we engage with these political conversations? But for us, diversity doesn't exist without those politics. It doesn't exist without that activism. That's a bit of a tension that I think funders, it might not even be something funders put on us, but it's something that we imagine based on our previous experiences with them.
Thank you, Richenda. I would like to, first of all, invite participants to ask their questions in the Q&A box. I was just thinking about what Adam mentioned in his presentation about being a DEI project. Just wanted to know a little bit more about that. My experience with foundations right now is that most of them are trying to integrate a DEI lens into their grant making, into their governance. So I'm just a little bit curious about what that meant exactly. And mainly, and this would lead us to the third question about integrating DEI into to help them actually work better with the grantees. And so, you know, in terms of funder-grantee relationship, I'm just wondering what has been your experience, Richenda and Katie, on, you know, building and maintaining those relationships with foundations. And you've talked about it a little bit, but what kind of challenges, if you had to summarize the challenges that you've encountered in actually, as an equity-focused organization, in building those relationships, and actually in building them more than in maintaining them? Because I think once that you build them, it's a little bit easier, I assume, to maintain them. So what was your experience? We'll start with Richenda.
Yeah, so I worked in fundraising for a while at Head and Hands before transitioning to my current position. And our entire fundraising team during that time was all Black folks, which had its own problems, as you'd imagine. And none of us had worked in philanthropy or in the fundraising sector before. We were all in the age mandate of our organizations. We were all under 25 as well in our team. And so we had no access to those networks. So getting in the door obviously is a challenge for any fundraiser who's new to the sector. It became more complicated for us actually after making first connections with funders, because that is where the perceived lack of experience or the actual lack of experience became more gendered and racialized for us. So with these networks that are inherently closed, you finally get into them, and then people call you the wrong name, or people simply don't respect your words, or you aren't believed to be capable, or you're seen from a charity model instead of a partnership model. All of these kind of dynamics pop up. So for us, we also have a community board, like Adam mentioned, so we don't have access to the philanthropic sector through our board at all. And we've done a really good job over the last 4 or 5 years or so of building a solid network with the philanthropic sector, which we didn't really have before. We were focused on more development-based fundraising for a long time. But even once we entered those spaces, it became clear that the way we were perceived and the way we were listened to and the way we existed was not the way that our white colleagues at other organizations experienced it, or our older colleagues at other organizations. So I'm trying to think of an example that I gave Adam in my interview, but it's escaping me now. But we talked about this at length because I've had many like microaggressive experiences with funders, and it doesn't affect my work. And I've learned to like live with that, but I've seen, you know, taking some of my colleagues who do frontline work to dinners or events with funders, and seeing them experience it for the first time reminds me of how much you're selling yourself. And when you hire staff who represent your clients, they're advocating for their own theoretical existence through advocating for their clients, through trying to get money. And that becomes very hard when you're experiencing these microaggressions while advocating for people who live like you, look like you, and experience what you do. So I think for me, once you get in the door, there's still a lot of work to do, and you can't really say that to funders, especially new relationships, because you want their money. So there is a bit of a soul selling feeling, especially when I was started, which was when I was new to the sector.
Thank you, Richenda, for sharing that. Yeah, I really appreciate it. It's very open from you. Thanks. Katie?
Yeah, I wanted to answer your question about the cool DEI project that people might ask for. So we have within our organization a Black Artist Mentorship Program that pairs established Black artists with emerging Black artists, and they work together to create a piece of artwork at the end, but there's also professional development and other network building in between. So we had a company approach us and ask if they could access these artists for their marketing company as part of their brand protection program. So we had to dig into what that meant a little bit. And what it actually meant is that they wanted to hire Black artists, so they were being perceived as employing Black folks to do work within their company. And it was one of those things where we were like, this isn't a great opportunity for our artists. And they didn't even look at the artist portfolio. It had nothing to do with our artists as individuals. So we said no to that opportunity. But it was one of those things that, you know, people see this as a way to further their own businesses, which I think maybe speaks to that cool DEI opportunity, which actually ends up becoming very tokenistic and harmful, which is why and for a small charity that's struggling in COVID, saying no to potential money is incredibly hard. And I find ourselves doing it more often these days as we start to really get to learn more about who our funders are. Back to this question around building relationships. It's really challenging to build relationships with folks. I see myself as the executive director. I'm an administrative sort of figurehead for the organization, but I'm not doing the work. I'm not working directly with our young people, but I have a whole group of people that are, and I love to put them in front of funders because to Richenda's point, the way that people can advocate, you know, almost for themselves, it's way more powerful than me bringing a deck and showing you pictures from a program. So it's hard though, because people want to meet with the executive director for some perceived level of power or influence, which I don't believe I have. We have a really non-hierarchical system in our organization. As a charity, we need to have a administrative figurehead, which is neat, but I feel like as funders, if you want to learn about an organization, ask to meet the project coordinators, ask to meet the frontline workers, because they're the folks who are going to give you real insight to how your money is being spent and the impact that it's making on the communities.
Thank you, Katie. Let us go to the last question on metrics and measurements. So how do metrics and evaluation feature in your relationship with funders? And are these approaches to measurement and evaluation helpful or harmful to equity-focused work? What do you think? What would be your suggestions of a better way to do it? And we'll start with Katie this time.
Yeah, we do a lot of work with children, which can be really challenging to collect data from. We don't ask, a lot of our programs are also drop-in, so there's no registration or knowing people's addresses or that sort of thing. And when you ask, you don't want to ask a kid what their address is, they're told not to tell you. So, you know, we find it really hard to follow these kids through their journeys. And this kind of goes back to the original question about project funding, is when a project is over, we also sometimes have to leave an entire community of young people behind until we're able to fund that project again. So if you want to see long-term evaluation, there has to be long-term funding attached to that. And, you know, we get asked questions like, how many of your kids who maybe took part in an after-school program for the last 2 years ended up becoming professional artists? And it's like, to track a young person through their youth into that is really challenging. We do have a couple that we've been able to, but without that being somebody's actual role, and we're a team of 7 people, so we don't have that sort of capacity, it's a really challenging thing to quantify. However, when we receive messages from teachers and parents and those sort of anecdotal moments, we know we're doing it right. However, it's hard to put metrics behind that when it's one person's experience. I also struggle with the checking the box around how many of the youth do you serve have mental illness? How many of the youth you serve are racialized? How many of the youth you serve are LGBTQ or identifying? So I struggle with those because I don't know. We don't ask them these kind of questions in an arts program or in a mentorship program. Sometimes they will share their lived experiences with us, but that's not part of why we're in these spaces. So I feel like when we are asked to measure people's identities, it really ignores the intersectionality that people exist in, and that it devalues the actual work and impact. It doesn't actually give us anything to work towards. It just doesn't seem valuable to me to know those numbers. It's the individual, the impact that's being made on them and their networks and communities.
Thanks, Katie. Richenda.
Yeah, I agree that it can be hard to collect data, especially demographic data. We have somewhat an easier time in some of our programs, like the medical clinic. You know, we get most of that information from clients right away. But it's something we negotiate internally a lot, because we like to keep data so we know that we're reaching our internal goals, and negotiate that with the frontline staff on a continuing basis, really. I think for us, the main challenge in reporting is, well, there's many, but one of the main challenges in reporting is measuring impact will never be accurate. We always put these goals, SMART goals, metrics, targets in our grant writing. And, you know, we're taught in fundraising that funders want high impact. And so you have to demonstrate high impact when you're trying to receive a new funding opportunity. But it removes kind of the individual value, I think, as Katie mentioned, and the further impact that your intervention can have. So for example, if we have a young person come into our organization for a pregnancy test at the clinic, and she discloses some sort of sexual violence, we give her condoms, which she can take to her friends, and we can never quantify how many youth were impacted by that intervention. Or we can counsel her about consent. She can intervene with her own friends after that counseling. We'll never understand that impact either. And so reporting that requires strictly numbers misses this holistic and really wide-reaching impact that interventions can have. And as Katie said, it kind of ignores the ways in which those identities intersect. What would it be different like if that teenager was racialized and queer, or racialized and trans, or any of these combinations will definitely change how we receive them and how they receive our services. I think a lot about how grantors can make reporting easier. With COVID, we've had some of those happen already. One of our funders said, you know, instead of a report, let's just have a phone call. I'll keep notes and that'll be your report, which we love. We do a lot of narrative-based reporting when we can, so it fits our work really well. But I think if you're working with organizations that especially are reflective of the clientele they serve, so Black-led organizations, queer-led organizations, et cetera, and your funding body has this power dynamic of privilege and or wealth, to truly inhabit justice and live DEI in a more radical or political way, you have to take on or take away some of that labor from the grantees who are overburdened, who are experiencing all of these things. And you should, you know, ask for reporting that's less than 2 pages, or ask for an annual report in a phone call, and then kind of take on the labor of distilling that phone call into something that your board wants to see, which could be a report. I think that there's ways to negotiate reporting with your grantees in a way that brings them success, but also means that you are reporting to the government or to your board exactly what they need to know, basically.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you, Richenda and Katie. And I guess I'm just going to ask a very direct question that's related to this. In the past, I mean, writing these reports, these narratives to send back to funders, philanthropic organizations that have supported your work, it hasn't been useful to you, has it? In terms of learnings within your own organization, how much of that is valid in terms of a statement?
Sorry, can you say that again? My internet went out for a second.
I was just saying that I'm sometimes what you're saying kind of highlights the fact that these reporting procedures and mechanisms to funders do not really serve you as an organization, as a learning organization yourself, who is trying to improve, you know, the interventions with the communities that you work with. So I was just highlighting that. So let's go to Q&As right now, because I think we do have, let me check the time. We have like around 10, 12 minutes. We have a few questions here in the Q&A box if you want to look at them. And really, I'm opening the floor for all three of you to answer one or several of these questions. We have one that is, I would like to highlight, which is from Brian, where he says that I see a difference between supporting DEI through initiatives that build bridges and break down stereotypes and those that directly support the position of racialized people in our society through, for example, mental health or employment-related or violence prevention services. Would anyone like to comment on that? Is there any difference as it relates to the topics being discussed here? Who wants to jump in?
I can try. There's definitely a connection between these two things. So building bridges and breaking down stereotypes, as well as mental health and employment services, are all part of elevating and creating space for racialized people to thrive in society. And work that we do does provide opportunities that typically are not available to the young people we serve, and which includes employment, but it also includes some mental health support, as well as making connections with people in their community. So it's this holistic approach. I don't think that they're actually separate items. I think that they all work together to help, I don't know what the right word is, but to help create that equity, that equitable outcome that we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Katie. Any more comments about this question?
Yeah, I can go. I agree that they go hand in hand in a lot of ways. I can say, for example, at my organization, because we have a bit of a diversity of services, we have things that address both sides of this. And we have a sex ed program, Safer Sex, Safer Self program with youth and teens. And in our organization, the difference between how we approach DEI in our frontline services and in our Safer Sex program are the same. Because, as I said before, it's always inherently politicized. And I think that funders can approach funding either kinds of projects kind of from the same area. I also think that when we focus on breaking down stereotypes, it can sometimes be quite simplistic stereotypes. It depends on the organization and what kind of work they're doing. But it can be, you know, big, large-scale human rights or breaking homophobia 101. And homophobia 101 is great for a lot of people, but it has to go somewhere else. And it has to go to 201, to 501. And that work is what's uncomfortable. And that's every time you scale that up, it becomes more political and potentially more contentious and more challenging for people receiving those services. And that is also where it becomes more challenging for staff. So if we're doing a Safer Sex program and one of the youth receiving that says something really violent to a facilitator, again, it comes back to like, all these dynamics exist together and stereotypes affect employment. And you know what I mean? So I think there's definitely some differences in funding and reporting for these categories, but ultimately they're part of a whole. And yeah.
Thank you. So because we only have around 5 minutes left, what I would suggest is that our panelists look at the questions that are in the Q&A box and try to, or if you want to include those in your final thoughts. And I would invite Adam, who opened his mic, to start.
Sure, great. I just want to say to that, to add to that last question, I mean, even if we, I know those examples are probably just examples, but even if we look at something like stereotypes and employment related stuff, stereotypes are, you know, shape how hiring is done, for instance. Like we need to look at these things from like a larger structural perspective. Things like racialized poverty, or like these are part of sort of like a larger system that trickles down and manifests in different ways around, you know, inequities in employment, or mental health challenges, or racialized policing, or the school to prison pipeline, or whatever we want to see. Like these are larger things. So I think that it's all sort of connected. And I think that when I think a lot of equity focused organizations that are, you know, looking at you know, the racial inequality or anti-indigeneity or something like that, they are looking at it from this more sort of structural perspective. And I think that might be one of the sort of the issues that DEI might not sort of might be sort of limited in terms of its ability to sort of reflect back on those larger sort of structural issues. Okay, looking through a bunch of these. Okay, so the first one around identity and positionality. I mean, I think that's obviously a really, really good question. I understand the optics that go with having a white guy doing work around DEI. I would say that my work on this topic came in sort of the path is a little strange. I've always done my research around studying up, so really looking at critically examining the systems that perpetuate white male wealth, essentially, and I study sort of philanthropy critically in that sense. And so I came at this DEI work not as sort of an anthropologist who is trying to study equity-focused organizations, but in an effort to sort of hold elites accountable in a way in terms of how they work to, you know, ostensibly towards social and economic justice. And then in terms of how I sort of acknowledge that positionality in the work that I do, I would say that I always approach my interviews around sort of relationship building. So for instance, something as small as sending all my interview transcripts back to my participants, which I promise I will get to you, Richenda and Katie, soon, so that they have sort of, they become the authors of the work and they have the second chance to do it. And also just building relationships in terms of familiarizing participants with the sort of activist work that I do too, to show that this research is sort of part of a larger project in solidarity with these particular struggles and movements. Just looking very quickly at the other ones, I would say that the takeaway 3, I would suggest that Richenda and Katie could probably give a better response to that than me at this point. And yeah, I think the intersectionality approach is interesting as well. I do think we're getting to the time where that has become a buzzword as well. So I don't know, I still think we need to dig deeper in that sense too, and make sure it's not just all about, you know, the symbolism, and that we're actually looking at like material, economic, political inequities in terms of the work that we do and the work that we fund.
Thank you, Adam. Any final thoughts, Richenda, Katie, whoever wants to go first?
I can go quickly. I have many thoughts about the last 2 questions, learning and unlearning and intersectional approach, and I can't talk about them all, but essentially my short answer is kind of what I mentioned before about taking on additional labor, and generally social justice praxis says that if you have more power, take on more of the labor and relieve the labor for those who are experiencing marginalization. So in a funder-fundee relationship, what that can look like, as I said, is the funder doing a little bit more work if they really want to invest in a community to make sure that community succeeds. And that's like making it a bit easier to do reporting, making it a bit easier to write grants, making yourself more flexible and more trusting, and allowing the fundee to make mistakes or to miss a deadline, and reassure them that it's not going to affect your relationship. I know that some funders try to do partnership style work to do that. Like, we're partners together. We're not partners. it's nice to have an aspiration of partnership, but ultimately you're giving us money. And so partnership can never exist on an equal playing field. And sometimes it feels ingenuine we have funders who are partners with us, absolutely. Sometimes we don't. And they still think that that's what we're working towards. But I think when you open up a new relationship with an organization, to take a moment to have a conversation about, like, what does your capacity feel like? I want to reassure you that we want to fund you. I want to make sure that we're helping you succeed. And living a bit in discomfort and allowing the grantee to make you a little bit uncomfortable sometimes. I talked to a government funder, so slightly different, where I gave them really upfront feedback about the structure of their funding stream and the reporting. And it felt really good to be allowed to do that. It's harder a little bit with private funding than it is with government, but letting your fundee know that you're receptive, and acknowledging the fact that you're never going to get it. And and that it's never going to be the same for anyone is a really good way that I've found with some of our funders who are just like, you're doing great, keep doing it, good luck. What do you need? Has always worked for us.
Thank you, Richenda, for those insights. Katie, final words.
Yeah, you just hit on exactly what I was going to say. Ask the grantee what they need. What keeps them up at night? What are they worried about? Really asking questions to learn about the pinch points of the organization is where you, as a funder, can have the most impact, and build an actual relationship that maybe one day could be a partnership. If you really build an interest and a sincere and authentic connection to the organization and the work that they're doing. And that only comes by asking questions, not saying we want a program that hits 100 kids in this neighborhood this year, go. And it's, if that's not what, we have learned is best, then ask us what we think is best. I think as far as addressing intersectionality, it's the same thing. You just got to ask who have you been seeing who needs the most support right now? How can we support them? Instead of choosing the buzzword of the day, when the Black Lives Matter protests took sort of a top line in the news, we received funding from people I've never met before, because they knew we had this Black Artist Mentorship Program. And we've reached back out now around, to let them know what we're up to, and it's radio silence. So try to create a long-term relationship where you get to see the actual outcomes of your work and ask questions along the way.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you everyone for your generosity with your time and openness. I know that it's not always easy to have these difficult conversations, so I really thank you for that. We appreciate you being here, and I will hand it over to you, Merve, to conclude the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here, everybody, and I really appreciated this panel. And thank you for our participants for joining us. I'd like to mention that our webinar Wednesdays will be taking a break next week, as our virtual gathering is the week after, between November 17th to the 19th. And please note that a follow-up Zoom email will be sent to all registrants tomorrow with the link to the recording, the presentation slides, and our conference's full programming and registration details. And as always, we welcome everyone to subscribe to our digest at pfc.ca and /COVID-19 to stay up to date. And thank you so much, guys. And I wish everybody a lovely day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.